At the height of the 20th century, on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 89th Street in New York, there stands a building that does not belong to the city around it. It is white, or nearly white, a soft, aged white now after 7 decades of Manhattan weather. It is round when the city is square. It leans slightly outward when the city leans upward. To a visitor who does not know its history, it looks like a shell washed onto the shore of a foreign coast. To a visitor who does know its history, it looks like exactly that, a shell washed up from a great distance, from a very long journey. Inside, if one walks the ramp slowly, from the ground floor to the T, one covers a quarter of a mile without ever once seeing a right angle. There are no galleries in the ordinary sense, no rooms one enters and leaves. There is only the curve, rising, and the paintings hung on the tilted wall as if they too were part of the ascent. The light comes from above, filtered through a glass dome, and settles on the walls with a quality that architects have tried, since the day the museum opened, to imitate elsewhere, and never quite succeeded. The name carved into the outside of this building is Guggenheim. It is a name that most visitors, if pressed, would associate with modern art, with Kandinsky, with Klee, with the abstract canvases that changed the 20th century. Few would associate it with anything else. Fewer still would guess that the same name, 100 years earlier, meant something entirely different. It meant silver. It meant copper. It meant lead. It meant the smoke rising from smelters in Colorado and Mexico, and the ore cars rolling down the mountains of Chile, and the ledgers kept in a house on West 77th Street, where 7 brothers argued in Swiss German about which mine to buy next. The smoke from those smelters had a particular color in the photographs of the period, the color of a dirty coin. The story of how one name traveled from those ledgers to that white spiral is the story of 3 generations. It is a story about a metal and a shipwreck and a baroness with a mission, and a woman in Venice who inherited less than her cousins and did more with it than any of them could imagine. It is also, in a quieter register, the story of the women whose lives were shaped by all of this, a Swiss stepsister who taught her sons to read poetry in a language none of them spoke well, a New York banker's daughter who wore mourning for a quarter of a century after her husband did not come home, a young painter who died in Paris in the middle of her life. Their names are not on the outside of the building. Their contribution to what the building came to mean was not smaller for that. The peddler who began it stepped off a ship in Philadelphia in the year 1847. He was 20 years old. His name was Meyer Guggenheim. He carried almost nothing. Meyer Guggenheim would never see the white spiral on Fifth Avenue. He would die in Palm Beach in 1905, more than half a century before the museum opened. But everything the museum was, the money that paid for it, the family that lent it their name, the peculiar collision of business and beauty that made it possible, began with him and with a peddler's cart and with a decision to leave a village of 200 people in the Aargau canton of Switzerland and cross the ocean. He did not know when he left Lengnau that he was leaving forever. Very few immigrants of that generation did. This is the story of the Guggenheim family, not the story of a fortune. The story of what a fortune made from the earth and lost in the water and remade in a room hung with abstract paintings does to the 3 generations that touch it. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. At the height of the 1840s, in the small village of Lengnau in the Aargau canton of Switzerland, there were 2 settlements permitted to Jewish families. Lengnau was one of them. Ending in a few miles down the road was the other. Beyond those 2 villages in the rest of Switzerland, the residence of Jewish families was, until the late 1850s, still constrained by law. The families of Lengnau had lived in Lengnau for centuries. They spoke a German dialect that even other Swiss found difficult. They had produced for 6 or 7 generations cantors and peddlers and cattle dealers, and in 1 or 2 cases in the 18th century, doctors who had been permitted to practice under Christian names. Meyer Guggenheim was born in Lengnau on the 1st of February, 1828, into the crowded lower rooms of a household where his father, Simon, worked as a tailor and where the family, After the death of Meyer's mother, Shofeli, when the boy was 6, fell into a poverty that no amount of tailoring could reverse. The house Meyer grew up in stood on a lane that led down to the river. There were 5 other children. There was very little heat in the winter. There was, according to Meyer's own recollections given decades later to his sons, a certain small library of books in the corner of the front room. Prayer books mostly, but also a few volumes of German poetry that had come into the household through his mother's side of the family, and that his father, who read them slowly, did not part with. The village Meyer grew up in was small enough that its adult population could be counted, and Jewish enough that its social life ran on a calendar different from the Christian villages a few valleys away. Boys of Meyer's generation, when they finished the little schooling they were given, went into one of 2 trades. They went to Zurich or Basel to apprentice in a workshop, or they went out on the roads with a peddler's license in a pack. Meyer went out on the roads. From the age of 8 or 9, he walked from farm to farm across the countryside selling small goods, pins, ribbons, thread, boot polish, small tools. The trade of the itinerant peddler, which in the Swiss cantons of that century required a license, a good pair of shoes, and the acceptance of humiliation as a fixed cost of doing business. He slept in the summers in the outbuildings of farms whose owners permitted it, and in the winters in the corner of a shop of an acquaintance in a village a day's walk from Lingnau. He was 14. He was 15. He was 16. In 1847, his father, now a widower for more than a decade, resolved to marry a widow of the community named Rachel Weil. Rachel Weil had children of her own. The Swiss regulations of the moment, applied to Jewish couples in a way they were not applied to others, made the marriage difficult where the Guggenheims lived. Simon, his fiancée, and their combined children, Meyer among them, decided to make the long crossing to America instead. They boarded a ship at Hamburg. They arrived in Philadelphia later that year. Meyer was 19 when he landed. He had almost no English and a peddler's German. He walked out into the streets of Philadelphia and did the only thing he knew how to do. He sold small goods from a cart from door to door. He sold to the Pennsylvania Dutch farmers of the surrounding countryside, whose German dialect he could understand and speak. He sold stove polish. He sold instant coffee. He noticed which items the housewives complained about and which items they praised, and adjusted his stock accordingly. Within 5 years, he had saved enough to buy a house. In 1852, at the age of 24, he married Barbara Myers. She had crossed the Atlantic on the same ship as his family 5 years earlier. She was the daughter of the widow his father had married. She was, in the strictest formal sense, his stepsister, a fact that later biographers would note with careful neutrality, since the two had not shared a household as children and were not related by blood. They settled in Roxborough in northwest Philadelphia. Between the year of their marriage and the year 1873, Barbara gave birth to 11 children who lived to adulthood. 7 of them were sons. Barbara Guggenheim is the least photographed figure in this story. There is one formal portrait of her, taken in later life, in which she sits with her hands folded and her face turned slightly to the side, and looks, one biographer wrote, less like the mother of a dynasty than like a woman who had raised a great many children in a country whose language she never entirely mastered. She was, by every surviving account, the family's cultural interior. Meyer taught his sons ledgers, negotiations, the reading of a shipping manifest. Barbara taught them, in whatever hours were left, that a library mattered, that music mattered, that a painting on a wall was not simply a decoration. 2 of her sons, Solomon and Benjamin, would grow up to marry women who believed the same thing, in the same tone. One of her granddaughters, Peggy, would grow up to build a museum on a Venetian canal. By the 1860s, Meyer had moved beyond stove polish. He had begun importing Swiss lace and embroidery, a business that suited a household of many daughters, since he could set them to inspecting the shipments in the parlor, and which required, above all, an eye for quality. The business succeeded modestly through the 1860s, expanded during the boom that followed the Civil War, and by 1872 had made Meyer Guggenheim comfortable, if not yet rich, and had allowed him to move his family into a larger house. Then, in the late 1870s, an acquaintance from the lace trade offered him a share in two silver mines in Colorado. The mines were called the AY and the Mini. They were located near a settlement called Leadville in the high mountains west of Denver. Leadville in those years was a boomtown of the classical sort, muddy streets, wooden buildings put up in a season and abandoned in the next, saloons that opened at dawn, and all around in the surrounding rock, the ore. Meyer bought his share in 1881 for a sum that his sons, decades later, would remember as trivial compared to what those two mines eventually produced. For a time, the two mines produced nothing. They were flooded. Meyer paid for pumps. The pumps failed. He paid for more pumps. He traveled to Leadville himself at the age of 53 and stood at the head of the shafts in a wind that came off the mountains at 10,000 feet and instructed the foreman not to give up. By 1882, the pumps had cleared the water and the ore was reachable. By 1883, the AY and the Mini were producing silver and lead in quantities that changed the arithmetic of the Guggenheim household forever. Meyer sat down with his sons and made a decision that shaped the rest of the story. He did not sell the mines. He did not, at that stage, even expand into new mines. He looked at what happened to the ore after it left the mountain and noticed that the smelters, the furnaces that separated the silver and the lead from the rock, were owned by other men, and that those other men took a cut of every ton that passed through their doors. He decided that the Guggenheims should own the furnaces. In 1888, he founded the Philadelphia Smelting and Refining Company. His sons, Isaac, Daniel, Murray, Solomon, Simon, Benjamin, William, were by now ranging in age from teenagers to men of 30, and Meyer put them to work. This was the shape of the family Meyer Guggenheim raised, 7 sons trained from the moment they could read a ledger to think about the metal after it left the ground. The daughters, Jeanette, Rose, Cora, and the others, were married into merchant families of the New York German Jewish community, into the Loebs, the Gimbels, the Rothschilds, the Seligmans. Meyer, in his private life, was described by the few outsiders who met him as a small, wiry man with a very white beard who spoke a heavily accented English and who ate the same breakfast every morning for 40 years. In his professional life, he was, by the standards of the men who did business with him, a formidable and slightly frightening person. Barbara, in these years, was quietly ill. She had developed diabetes in her 50s, in a decade before there was any effective treatment for it, and she declined slowly through the late 1890s. She died in 1900 at the age of 66. Her sons, some of them by then the richest men in America, gave $200,000 to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York for a building in her name. Meyer lived 4 more years, taken care of by a housekeeper, and died of a slowly advancing cancer in Palm Beach in March of 1905 at the age of 77. He left the mining interest to be divided among his 7 sons in equal shares. 7 equal shares of a fortune that, by 1905, already dominated the smelting of ore in the United States and controlled a growing share of the mining and smelting of Mexico. The peddler was gone. The metal remained. And the 7 brothers, from that moment forward, would run the fortune together, or lose it together, and would try, over the next quarter century, to do both. At the height of the 1890s, the American West was still producing ore in quantities that no European economy had ever seen. Silver, lead, copper, zinc, the metals were coming out of the ground in Colorado, in Utah, in Montana, in Idaho, in Nevada, and increasingly from the great rich seams of northern and central Mexico. The problem for the men who owned the metal was not extraction. The problem was consolidation. There were too many operators, too many small smelters, too many independent refineries, each of them competing on price and none of them large enough to set the terms of the market. The Guggenheim brothers understood this problem earlier than most of their competitors. By 1895, the family was earning more than $1 million a year from its smelters at Pueblo in Colorado and at Monterrey and Aguascalientes in northern Mexico. Daniel Guggenheim, the second-born son of Meyer, had emerged as the strategist. He was, by every account of the men who worked with him, the most ruthless of the brothers and the most patient. Isaac, the eldest, deferred to him. Murray preferred the offices. Solomon was, at that stage, a competent operator with no particular interior beyond his work. Simon lived mostly in Colorado. Benjamin was already restless. William, the youngest, was drifting. In 1899, a syndicate led by Henry H. Rogers, a lieutenant of John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil Trust, organized a great consolidation of American smelting operations under a single corporate roof, the American Smelting and Refining Company. 23 separate smelting concerns were folded into it. Rogers, Rockefeller, and the Lewison brothers took the controlling shares. When Rogers invited the Guggenheims to join in the same year, Daniel Guggenheim declined. The Guggenheims, he explained, were not interested in being partners in an enterprise they did not control. What followed, in the language of Wall Street, was a war. In 1900, the New American Smelting and Refining Company, soon known by its initials, ASARCO, was hit with 2 months of worker strikes. Daniel Guggenheim, watching from outside the trust, increased production at every Guggenheim smelter he owned. He flooded the market with cheap lead and cheap silver. He drove prices downward. He offered better terms to the independent mine owners of Colorado and Utah and drew their ore away from ASARCO's furnaces to his own. As ASARCO's stock fell in the market, he quietly bought it. By the winter of 1900, the directors of ASARCO understood that they were losing. They sent representatives to New York to negotiate. The negotiations lasted through the early months of the new year. In April of 1901, the merger was signed. The Guggenheim brothers turned over their smelting properties and their working capital to ASARCO. In return, they received $45 million in ASARCO stock, a controlling interest, and seats on the board. Daniel Guggenheim became president. His brothers took the other senior positions. The men who had built ASARCO to keep the Guggenheims out of it, less than 2 years earlier, now worked for them. This was the moment the metal became an empire. Under Daniel's presidency, ASARCO expanded across Mexico with a speed that no earlier trust had matched. The smelters at Monterrey and Aguascalientes were enlarged. New copper mines were acquired at Cananea in Sonora and at Chuquicamata in the north of Chile, where the ore body was the largest in the world and where the family, in partnership with other financiers, built the mining town from nothing. Hospitals, schools, a company store, workers' housing built by an architect brought out from New York. The photographs of Chuquicamata from the years before the First World War show a company town of the classical American type, laid out on a grid, set down in the driest desert on earth, and inhabited by 20,000 people who had come from every corner of Chile and Bolivia and Peru to work the terraced pit that rose above them. In Utah, the brothers took over the Bingham Canyon copper operation, which became and remained for the next century one of the largest open-pit mines on Earth, a hole visible in later decades from the windows of aircraft flying over Salt Lake City. In Alaska, they organized the Kennecott Copper Corporation, whose ore trains ran through wilderness that had no other railway, and whose engineers had to design bridges that could stand up to the frost heaves of the Copper River. By 1912, ASARCO under Guggenheim control was smelting nearly 90% of the lead produced in the United States, and Guggenheim interests, held in various corporate vehicles, were operating on 4 continents. The men who worked these mines and smelters were not, by and large, remembered by name. The industrial safety of the early 20th century was of a kind that would, 100 years later, appear unspeakable. Deaths in the shafts of Bingham Canyon, in the smelter towns of northern Mexico, in the terraces of Chuquicamata, occurred at rates that no modern industry would tolerate and were at the time part of the price of the metal. The Guggenheim brothers, in the ledgers, treated these deaths as an actuarial matter. In the memoirs, the surviving grandchildren later wrote, "The mines and smelters were not discussed at all. What was discussed was the collection at the plaza. What was discussed was the yacht." The men who ran this empire in these years were a small brotherhood. The 7 sons of Meyer met on Saturday mornings at the offices of E.M. Guggenheim's sons in New York and divided the work between them. Isaac, the eldest, handled shipping. Daniel handled acquisitions. Murray handled the offices. Solomon handled sales. Simon, elected United States Senator from Colorado in 1906, handled the political questions. William drifted in and out. Benjamin, by 1910, had left the firm. The break with Benjamin was, in the Guggenheim household, an emotional event more than a business one. Benjamin was the fifth brother. He had been sent as a young man to run the Guggenheim smelter at Pueblo in Colorado, and had done it well. But he had a temperament that his brothers did not share, a lightness of manner, a willingness to be interested in things that made no money. And by the second decade of the new century, he had come to believe that he did not want to spend the rest of his life inside the family firm. In 1910, he sold his share in the smelting enterprise to his brothers, at a price that valued him considerably below what he might have received if he had stayed, and set up in a small office of his own at 99 John Street in New York to invest in mining machinery. His marriage by that year had also cooled. He had married Florette Seligman of the New York banking family in 1894. They had three daughters: Benita, born in 1895, Marguerite, called Peggy, born in 1898, and Barbara Hazel, born in 1903. But by the second decade of the century, Benjamin was spending more of his time in Paris than in New York, and more of his time with a young French singer named Leontine Aubar than with his wife. Meyer by then had been dead for 5 years. Barbara longer. The brotherhood at the head of the firm, Isaac, Daniel, Murray, Solomon, Simon, and, in his diminished way, William, kept meeting on Saturdays. Benjamin, once a member of that gathering, no longer appeared. The metal was still coming out of the ground. The furnaces were still lit, and in April of 1912, Benjamin decided to come home. At the height of the spring of 1912, in Paris, Benjamin Guggenheim booked a passage back to New York. He was by then a slightly stooped man of 46 with a mustache that had begun to turn gray and a manner of dress that his brothers in New York would have called French. He had been living more or less continuously in a suite at the Hotel Ritz on the Place Vendôme for several years. His personal affairs, in the assessment of his brothers, had become disordered. His business affairs, the small mining machinery office at 99 John Street in New York, had not prospered as he had promised his brothers in 1910 that they would. He was traveling with Leontine Aubar, her maid, his valet, a young Egyptian-born Englishman named Victor Giglio, and his chauffeur, a Frenchman named René Pernot. He was returning, according to the surviving correspondence, to attend to business at his New York office and to see his daughters, whom he had not seen for several months. The ship he had originally booked passage on, the Lusitania of the Cunard Line, suffered a mechanical failure and was withdrawn from service. Benjamin and his party transferred their tickets to a newer vessel of a rival line on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The ship was the Titanic. Benjamin, Leontine Aubar, and Victor Giglio boarded her first-class cabins on the 10th of April. René Pernot, the chauffeur, traveled in second class. The other passengers of the first-class dining saloon included John Jacob Astor, IV, and his young second wife, Madeline, returning from their honeymoon and shadowed by the New York press for having married her at all, Isidore Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, who had been married for 41 years, Benjamin Guggenheim, in his 65th year of life, dressed for dinner and traveling with a woman who was not his wife. Benjamin and Leontine ate at their own small table. They did not, according to the recollections of the surviving stewards, mix much with the other first-class passengers. On the evening of the 14th of April, a Sunday, dinner was served at the usual hour. It included consommé, a fish course of poached salmon and mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily, lamb, roast duckling, sirloin of beef, and a range of desserts. The Guggenheim party ate. After dinner, Benjamin escorted Leontine to her cabin. He returned, according to Etches, to his own cabin, B82, sometime before 11 o'clock. He read for a while. He undressed. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 on the night of the 14th of April, off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. In the first hour after the collision, the ship's officers went cabin to cabin, waking the passengers and instructing them to put on life belts and come up to the boat deck. In cabin B82, first class, Benjamin Guggenheim was woken by a bedroom steward named Henry Etches. Etches, who survived the sinking and gave testimony afterwards, remembered Benjamin's reluctance to put on the life belt. He remembered persuading him. He remembered adding a thick sweater to keep out the cold of the deck. He remembered sending Benjamin up. The cold that night was of a kind that most of the first-class passengers had never encountered. The North Atlantic in April, in the region where the icebergs drift down from Greenland, sits at a temperature only slightly above the point at which seawater freezes. The air was still. The sea was calm. There was no moon. The stars, the officers on the bridge had remarked on it during the earlier watches, were unusually bright. What Benjamin did next has been reconstructed in the century since from the accounts of several survivors, from Atches, from another steward named James Johnson, from a French passenger named Rose Icard, who spoke to a lifeboat officer, and from the fragmentary recollections of Leontine Barr, who was placed with her maid into lifeboat number 9 and who lived. From these accounts, the following can be said with reasonable confidence. At some point during the second hour after the collision, Benjamin Guggenheim returned to his cabin. Victor Giglio, his valet, was with him. The two of them removed their sweaters, their life belts, and the informal clothing they had come up in. They put on their full evening wear, white ties, white waistcoats, tailcoats. Benjamin took a rose from a small vase in the cabin and placed it in his buttonhole. They went back up to the boat deck, dressed as if for dinner in a room that no longer existed. The remark that has attached itself to this decision, "We have dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen," was reported by Etches in an interview given to the New York Times a few days after the sinking. Whether the words were spoken exactly as Etches remembered them, or whether they were the polishing of a phrase that a shocked steward reconstructed from something less exact, no document now can settle. What is certain is that Benjamin, before he sent Etches away, asked him to carry a message to New York. "If anything should happen to me," he said, "tell my wife in New York that I have done my best in doing my duty." He was reported afterwards by 2 independent survivors to have been seen sitting on the deck in his evening wear at some point in the small hours of the 15th of April in the company of Victor Giglio, with what may have been a cigar. Whether the cigar was actually lit or whether the detail was added later by newspaper men looking for the picturesque is one of the many small uncertainties of that night. There are photographs of the Titanic. There are no photographs of that particular deck at that particular hour. The Titanic went under at 20 past 2 in the morning of the 15th of April. She broke at some point in the last minutes unto 2 sections. The forward section descended first. The stern section rose almost vertical and hung and fell. In the water afterwards, for perhaps 20 minutes, the sound of some 700 people calling for help carried across the still sea to the lifeboats already launched. Only one boat, lifeboat number 14, under Officer Harold Lowe, turned back. It picked up 4 survivors. The rest of the men and women in the water did not survive the temperature of it long enough to be rescued when the Carpathia arrived at dawn. Benjamin Guggenheim, Victor Giglio, and René Pernot were among the 1,500 and more who did not survive. Their bodies were never recovered. Leontine Barr reached New York on the Carpathia, collected her belongings from Benjamin's suite at the Ritz through intermediaries, and returned to Paris. She lived until 1964. She never spoke publicly about that night. The news reached Florette Seligman Guggenheim in New York on the morning of the 16th of April. She was 42 years old. She had 3 daughters at home, Benita, 17, Peggy, 13, Barbara Hazel, 9. Peggy, who was in the middle of that day at her Manhattan school, was called into the headmistress's office and told that her father was missing. It was not until later that afternoon that the family understood he had been aboard the Titanic. It was not until the following day that they accepted that he had not been picked up by any lifeboat. Peggy would remember, decades later in her memoir, the peculiar quality of the light in the mistress's office that morning. She would remember that she did not immediately cry. Florette wore mourning for the rest of her life. She was, in the assessment of her daughters and her sisters, a woman of limited emotional range whose limitations became more pronounced after her husband's death. She had a habit of repeating each thing she said 3 times, which her daughters, cruelly in the manner of daughters, teased her for. She would live another 25 years, dying in 1937, and would leave, on her death, a small fortune that her daughters had already been living on. Because Benjamin had left the family firm in 1910, and because his mining machinery office had not prospered as his brother's Zasarco shares had, the estate he left behind was, by Guggenheim standards, modest. When Peggy came of age in 1919 and inherited her share, it amounted to $2.5 million, a large fortune by the standards of anyone outside her family, and a fraction of what her first cousins were about to receive. Peggy, for the rest of her life, would understand herself as the poor relation. It was an understanding that shaped, in ways her cousins in New York did not quite grasp, everything she would afterwards do with her own inheritance. The other brothers in New York absorbed the news of Benjamin's death with an emotion that his estranged position in the firm made difficult to express. Daniel, in particular, had never fully forgiven his brother for leaving. The public statements the family issued in the days after the sinking praised Benjamin's conduct in the highest terms. A fund was established in his name for the education of the children of miners. The private letters from Daniel and from Isaac and from Murray were shorter and more restrained. What followed was a decision, taken quietly, to look after Benjamin's daughters, Peggy in particular, but not to bring the tragedy into the running of the firm. The metal continued to flow. In the way that these things happen, Benjamin Guggenheim became, in the first weeks after the sinking, the popular hero of the disaster. His conduct, more than any other passenger's, was quoted from pulpits and reprinted in the illustrated weeklies. The image of the millionaire in white tie, refusing a place in a lifeboat, offering it to a woman, drinking a last brandy in evening dress. This image did more in the public imagination of 1912 to define what the word gentleman meant than any actual gentleman then living had ever done. It attached to the Guggenheim name a moral dimension the family had, until then, entirely lacked. The 7 brothers who had cornered Zasarco were now, in the mind of the American public, associated with the 5th of them, who had died so well. That the 5th of them had died on his way home to New York from a Parisian mistress, and had been traveling on the Titanic in the first place because his first-choice ship was being repaired, and had gone down while his brother in New York was in the middle of a lawsuit about a Bingham Canyon copper stake, none of these details reached the pulpits. Some deaths, in the end, edit the lives that preceded them more than they resemble them. At the height of the second decade of the 20th century, the Guggenheim empire was at the apex of its industrial reach. Zasarco controlled 90% of American lead smelting. Kennecott was producing copper in Alaska in quantities that outstripped every other American operation. Chuquicamata in Chile was open. The brothers were, in aggregate, worth a sum that placed them among the 6 or 7 wealthiest families in the United States. Daniel Guggenheim was president of Zasarco and had been for 18 years. The First World War brought a further expansion of demand for the metals the family controlled. Copper for shell casings, lead for bullets, zinc for brass. The war economies of Europe and, from 1917 onward, of the United States needed everything the Guggenheim smelters could produce. Daniel supplied it and grew richer. Then, in 1919, at the age of 63, he stepped down. He resigned the presidency of Zasarco. Murray and Solomon gave up their board positions the same year. The reasons were complicated, a mixture of exhaustion, of internal disagreement about the future of the industry, and of a growing sense in the older brothers that the sons of the 3rd generation should not simply inherit Zasarco, but should be permitted to do something with the fortune that was not smelting. Daniel retired to his estate at Hempstead House on Long Island at Sands Point and turned his attention to something that, in 1919, no one in Wall Street quite understood him to be serious about. He turned his attention to aviation. His only son, Harry Frank Guggenheim, was, at the end of the war, 28 years old, a graduate of Cambridge, and a veteran naval aviator. Harry had flown reconnaissance missions in France and Italy in 1917 and 1918. He had come home convinced that the aeroplane was going to reshape the 20th century in the way that the smelter had reshaped the 19th. Daniel, listening to his son over dinners at Sands Point, came to agree. In 1924, Daniel and his wife Florence Schloss established the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Foundation. In 1926, they established, within the foundation, the Daniel Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics, capitalized at $3 million, a substantial sum in that decade, and put Harry in charge of it. The fund's stated purpose was, in Daniel's phrase, to promote aeronautical education, to assist in the development of commercial aircraft, and to further the science of aeronautics. In practice, over the next 4 years, it did more than that. The fund established the first Guggenheim School of Aeronautics at New York University in 1925. It funded the first 6 schools of aeronautical engineering in the United States. It paid for the first weather reporting service designed exclusively for passenger aircraft, and provided the equipment loan that permitted the first regularly scheduled commercial passenger airline in the country to begin operating. It paid the university salaries of the men who trained the American aviation engineers of the following decade. Theodore von Karman at the California Institute of Technology, Jerome Hunsaker at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When Charles Lindbergh returned from Paris in 1927, having made the first solo Atlantic crossing, it was Harry Guggenheim who accompanied him on the tour of the United States that followed. When Lindbergh was asked, later in his life, which 2 men had contributed most to the birth of modern aviation, he named Harry Guggenheim as one of them. The other man Lindbergh named was a physics professor from Worcester, Massachusetts, named Robert Hutchings Goddard. Goddard, in the middle of the 1920s, was working on liquid-fueled rocketry, a field so obscure at that moment that the New York Times had published an editorial in 1920 accusing him of not understanding basic physics. He was working out of a small laboratory in Worcester on a budget the size of a schoolteacher's salary at Clark University, where he was a physics professor and where his colleagues, some of them, considered him harmless. In 1926, on the 16th of March, on the farm of his aunt Effie Ward in Auburn, Massachusetts, he had launched the first liquid-fueled rocket in history. It rose 41 feet, flew for 2.5 seconds, and landed in a cabbage patch. The photograph of Goddard standing next to the launching frame, a thin man in a heavy overcoat, hat pulled low, hand resting on a piece of pipe that would, decades later, be recognized as an ancestor of every rocket engine that had ever flown, changed nothing in the public estimation. It changed everything in the private estimation of the small number of engineers who understood what they had just seen. Harry Guggenheim, having read one of Goddard's papers, went to Worcester. He met the professor. He listened. He noted that the professor's fingers were stained from soldering. He came home to his father Daniel and to Charles Lindbergh, whom he had drawn into the conversation, and proposed that the Guggenheim family should quietly fund Goddard's work. Daniel agreed. In 1930, the Guggenheim Fund gave Robert Goddard the first serious money he had ever received for his research, enough to move his laboratory to Roswell, New Mexico, where the weather was better and the launch sites were empty, and to build the rockets that, over the following decade, established every fundamental principle of modern liquid-fueled rocketry. Goddard's Roswell workshop at Mescalero Ranch ran through the 1930s on Guggenheim money. Harry visited it several times. Lindbergh visited it. Goddard's rockets rose, in that decade, to altitudes of 1.5 miles and returned and were rebuilt and rose again. Goddard died in August of 1945 of throat cancer, 4 months before the German rocket engineers at Peenemünde, who had, unbeknownst to him, been studying his patents for years, were captured by the Americans and taken to New Mexico, to the same test ranges where Goddard had worked. His widow Esther, some years later, sold his patents to the United States government for a sum that acknowledged, retrospectively, what her husband had built. Every liquid-fueled rocket engine that has ever flown in the American space program, the engines of the Vanguard, the Redstone, the Atlas, the Saturn V that carried Apollo 11 to the moon on the 20th of July, 1969, traces its lineage to Goddard's work. And Goddard's work, in the years when it mattered most, was funded by a foundation set up by the son of a Swiss peddler and administered by a grandson who had been trained to fly reconnaissance planes over the Adriatic. Daniel Guggenheim died in September of 1930 at Hempstead House of a heart condition. He was 74. Harry, who had taken over the running of the fund several years earlier, continued to expand it, and later founded a separate foundation dedicated to the study of dominance and violence in human affairs, a private preoccupation of his final decades. Harry served as United States ambassador to Cuba from 1929 to 1933 under Herbert Hoover. He founded in 1940, with his third wife, Alicia Patterson, the Long Island newspaper Newsday. He rejoined the Navy at the outbreak of the Second World War and served in the Pacific on an escort carrier called the USS Nahenta Bay. In 1963, when Alicia died, he took over as publisher of Newsday himself and ran it until 1967. He sold his interest to the Times Mirror Company in 1970. He died in January of 1971 at Falaise, his Long Island mansion at Sands Point, at the age of 80. He was buried at Salem Field Cemetery in Brooklyn, in the family plot near the graves of the aunts and uncles who had all worked at the same Saturday morning meetings on Monsieur Guggenheim's sons. This is what the second generation of the Guggenheim family made of the fortune the first generation had built out of metal. Daniel, who took the empire to its peak, chose in the second half of his life to give some part of it to a physicist most of his contemporaries considered a crank, and to a young pilot who wanted to fly to Paris, and to schools of aeronautical engineering that did not yet exist. The metal, which had begun in the mountains of Colorado, ended, in the branch of the family that Daniel led, in the exhaust plumes of rockets that would eventually reach the moon. But Daniel was not the only Guggenheim brother who came, in the middle of his life, to feel that the metal on its own was not enough. His younger brother Solomon, the third of the 7 working sons, born in Philadelphia in 1861, was, by the middle of the 1920s, 65 years old, a widower's age but not yet a widower, immensely rich, retired from active management of a Sarco, and by his own quiet estimation, bored. Solomon Guggenheim had married Irene Rothschild in the year 1895. She was not from the European Rothschilds of the banking dynasty, a distinction that the New York press of the period frequently failed to make, but from a New York merchant family who happened to share the name. She was cultivated, she read German. She played the piano tolerably well. She was interested in painting and had been, since her girlhood in a household where the walls carried what her own mother had been able to afford of the American Landscape School. She and Solomon had 3 daughters, Eleanor, born in 1896, who would in 1920 marry an English aristocrat, the 7th Earl Castle Stewart, and settle in Northamptonshire, and whose grandson would inherit the earldom she brought into the family, Gertrude, born in 1898, and Barbara, born in 1904. Solomon's household ran on Fifth Avenue and at Trelora Court, a country house on Long Island. His art collection in 1926 was of a kind then conventional for a rich American of his generation. Corot's, some Rembrandt drawings, a few of the American landscape painters of the previous century hung along the halls of the Plaza Hotel apartment where he and Irene spent their winters. It was pleasant enough. It suggested nothing. In the summer of 1926, Irene decided that she wanted a portrait of her husband. It was to be a gift for his 66th birthday. She had seen at a small gallery in New York the work of a young German artist who had recently arrived in the United States. The artist was a baroness of minor Alsatian nobility. Her name was Hildegard Anna Augusta Elizabeth Riebe von Ehrenwiesen, and she signed her paintings Hilla Riebe. Irene commissioned her that summer to paint Solomon. The Baroness came to sit with Solomon on several afternoons at the plaza. She was, in her mid-30s, a small, intense, opinionated woman who spoke German-accented English with the certainty of a person who had never once in her life considered that she might be wrong. She had arrived in the United States in 1927 from Berlin, where she had for nearly a decade lived and worked with an abstract painter named Rudolf Bauer, a relationship that was, by her own account, romantic, and by his account, difficult. And that would go on in one form or another until his death in New Jersey in the early 1950s. She had come to New York because Bauer's American career, which she believed she could manage from a distance better than he was managing it on his own, required her presence. As she worked on the portrait of Solomon Guggenheim, she noticed the paintings on the walls around her, the Corot's, the placid 19th century landscapes, and in a voice that suggested she was doing him a favor, told Solomon Guggenheim that his taste was entirely of the previous century and that he did not yet understand that the 20th century had begun. She said this while holding a paintbrush. She said it, according to a witness afterwards, without malice, in the tone in which a doctor tells a patient that something needs to be changed. Solomon, one biographer later wrote, was accustomed to being told that he did not understand something by his brother Daniel. He was not accustomed to being told the same thing by a woman half his age with paint on her fingers. He asked politely what he should be looking at instead. The Baroness told him. She showed him, at her studio, the paintings of Rudolf Bauer, who painted geometric abstractions of the kind Solomon Guggenheim had never seen, orbs and rectangles arranged on white grounds, with a formal precision that reminded Solomon, if he had let himself see the parallel, of the diagrams of ore bodies his engineers drew for him at Asarco. She spoke to him of a movement she called non-objective painting, the term she preferred to abstract art, because, in her view, the paintings were not abstractions of a real subject, but new objects entirely, independent of the natural world. She spoke of it as if she were preaching a religion. In her own understanding, she was. Uribe believed that non-objective painting had a spiritual dimension that no earlier form of art possessed. She believed that the rise of it in Europe in the first quarter of the 20th century was, if the world was paying attention, one of the great events of the age, as important, in her private ordering of significance, as any invention of the industrial century. She was, at that first meeting with Solomon Guggenheim, 36 years old, and had spent nearly 2 decades in the company of Kandinsky, of Klee, of Chagall, of the artists of the November Group in Berlin, and the Salon des Indépendants in Paris. She knew better than any American then living what the European avant-garde was doing, and she believed, with a conviction that neither her critics nor her later biographers ever quite understood, that a rich American businessman of 66, who had built a fortune from silver and copper and lead, could be the vehicle by which non-objective painting was brought to the United States. It was, in that summer of 1926, an unlikely conviction. It turned out to be entirely correct. Solomon Guggenheim listened. And then over the next 4 years, he did something no one who had known him in the Asarco offices would have predicted. He sold the Corot's. He began to buy Kandinsky's. In 1930, Uribe accompanied him and Irene on a trip through Europe. In Dessau, in Germany, she took them to the studio of Wassily Kandinsky. They purchased Composition 8 from the year 1923, a work that is still on the walls of the Guggenheim Museum. Over the next several years, at Ribe's guidance, Solomon assembled what became the largest private collection of Kandinsky in the world, and one of the largest collections of Bauer and of Klee and of Leger. By the middle of the 1930s, the paintings had overflowed the Plaza Hotel apartment. Solomon rented an empty automobile showroom at 24 East 54th Street, and on the 1st of June of 1939, opened at that address an institution he called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. Uribe was its founding director. The first exhibition was titled Art of Tomorrow. It featured Kandinsky, Bauer, Ribe herself, and a rotating cast of the young European painters Ribe believed the American public needed to see. The reception in the New York press of 1939 was mixed. Some critics dismissed the museum as an eccentric private enthusiasm of a rich man. Some critics understood, more clearly than the museum's opponents did, that something had shifted. What none of the critics understood in 1939 was that the rented showroom was a temporary structure, and that Uribe had already begun to think about the building she wanted next. In June of 1943, she wrote a letter. It was addressed to Frank Lloyd Wright in Wisconsin. She was, at that moment, 53 years old and had never met him. She wrote in her characteristic tone of a woman who assumed that anyone she wrote to would understand the importance of what she was proposing, that she required a museum temple. She wrote that non-objective painting demanded an architecture that had never yet been built. She wrote that Solomon Guggenheim had the money to build it, and that she had the vision to specify it, and that Frank Lloyd Wright was the only architect in America who could design it. She invited him to New York. Wright, who was in his mid-70s, the most famous American architect alive, accepted. Over the following 15 years, he produced, in collaboration with Hilla Rebay, and until his death, with Solomon Guggenheim, the design that stands on Fifth Avenue today. The ramp, the curve. The absence of right angles. The single continuous gallery rising in a spiral from ground floor to skylight. Wright once said of the project, and the remark was recorded by his associates, that he had built the museum only for Rebay. It was a compliment of a kind, and it was also, in the way Wright meant it, a statement of fact. Solomon Guggenheim did not live to see the building open. He died at his Long Island estate in November of 1949, at the age of 88, of heart failure. Frank Lloyd Wright died in April of 1959, at the age of 91, 6 months before the museum's ribbon was cut. Hilla Rebay lived to see the building open. She did not see it open as its director. Within a year of Solomon's death, the trustees of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, a body Solomon had established in 1937, and on which several of Solomon's nephews and cousins sat, voted to remove Hilla Rebay from her position. The reasons were multiple. Rebay's autocratic manner had made her enemies among the trustees, among the artists whose work she had refused to show, and, most consequentially, among the Guggenheim family itself. Peggy Guggenheim, Solomon's niece, had run her own gallery in New York during the war, called Art of the Century, and had disliked Rebay so thoroughly that the two women, for the last decade of Solomon's life, had communicated only through intermediaries. Rebay's professional judgments had also, in the eyes of many observers, narrowed as she aged. She had refused to acknowledge the significance of Cubism, had dismissed Picasso, and had insisted on a rigid distinction between non-objective and abstract painting that increasingly few younger critics were willing to accept. She was replaced in 1952 by an American curator named James Johnson Sweeney. Sweeney reversed a number of her policies. The museum began to acquire the very artists Rebay had refused to show. When the building on Fifth Avenue opened on the 21st of October, 1959, Rebay was not invited. She had retreated by then to a house in Greens Farms in Connecticut, where she lived quietly, painted, and gave away part of her personal collection to the museum she was no longer permitted to enter. Hilla Rebay lived through the last decade of her life in the Connecticut house, mostly alone. Rudolph Bauer, the painter she had loved and defended for a quarter of a century, had died of lung cancer at his own house in New Jersey in the autumn of 1953, having, in his last years, quarreled with her bitterly over what he considered her mismanagement of his American career. Her cousin, who lived nearby, visited when she could. Rebay painted. She continued to work in the biomorphic linear style she had developed in the 1940s. She wrote letters to her old associates in Germany, some of whom answered. She read. She kept in the front room the archives of her correspondence with Solomon Guggenheim, the letters, the diagrams she had drawn for him explaining non-objective composition, the receipts from Kandinsky's studio. On the 21st of October, 1959, when the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum opened on Fifth Avenue and the New York press gathered to see the White Spiral, for the first time, Hilla Rebay was not there. She had been informed, indirectly, that her presence would be awkward. She stayed at Greens Farms. She did not, according to a friend who saw her that week, comment on the omission. Hilla Rebay died at Greens Farms in September of 1967 at the age of 77 of a heart and circulatory condition that had troubled her for several years. According to her wishes, her ashes were carried back to Germany and buried in the family grave at Tenningen, in Baden. Part of her private collection, the paintings by Kandinsky, by Klee, by Gleises, by Kurt Schwitters, that she had bought for herself over the decades while she had bought others for Solomon, went to the museum whose founding she had proposed as a bequest. Her name was, for many years afterwards, allowed to fade from the museum's official history. In the last 2 decades, it has been quietly restored. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum today acknowledges her as its co-founder. The letter she wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright in June of 1943, requesting a museum temple, is displayed in the archive. It is written on plain letterhead. The handwriting is small and forward slanted. It reads, in the middle, "I want a temple of spirit, a monument." The white spiral on Fifth Avenue was, in the way these things always are, the work of several hands. Solomon paid for it. Wright designed it. But it was Hilaribe who had, in June of 1943, first written down what it should be, and who had spent the last 2 decades of her life on the belief that a rich American widower could be persuaded at the age of 66 that the 20th century had begun. She was, in that belief, correct, and she paid for that correctness by being written out of the story she had, more than anyone, made possible. The younger Guggenheim, who saw all of this, the mines, the smelters, the shipwreck, the aeronautics, the spiral, from a position closer to the family and further from its center than any of her cousins, was Peggy Guggenheim. She was the daughter of Benjamin. She was the niece of Solomon. She had inherited a fraction of what her cousins had inherited. And she had lived, from the moment her father did not come home, at a certain angle to the family that had made him. Marguerite Guggenheim had been born in New York in August of 1898. She was the middle of 3 sisters. She was, in her own recollection, the plainest of the 3, a self-assessment reinforced, in the way children reinforce these things, by the sisters themselves and never afterwards revised, though photographs of her at 20 tell a different story than the one she had learned to tell about herself. She was 13 when her father died. She was educated by tutors in the Guggenheim manner, French, piano, deportment, and finished her schooling at a private academy in New York called the Jacobi School in 1915. She was, by her 20th year, a woman of high nervous energy, considerable intelligence, and a habit inherited perhaps from her mother's compulsive repetitions of finding the same emotional dynamics over and over in the men she chose to give her attention to. In 1919, on her 21st birthday, she inherited $2.5 million from her father's residuary estate. She spent the first 2 years afterwards working, unpaid, at a bookshop in Manhattan called the Sunwise Turn, a bohemian establishment of the kind that the daughters of Fifth Avenue were not usually seen inside. She read every modern book on the shelves. She met the men and women, mostly older than her, who ran the place, and within 2 years she had left New York for Paris. Paris in 1921 was the Paris of Juna Barnes, of Marcel Duchamp, of Man Ray, of Ezra Pound and Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein. Peggy Guggenheim, arriving with the accent of an East Coast heiress and the money of a Guggenheim, was welcomed into all of it. She rented an apartment on the left bank. She met Duchamp at Constantin Brancusi's studio. She sat for Man Ray. She was photographed in the middle of the decade, wearing a dress by Paul Poiret and a headdress by Vera Stravinsky. The photograph is still reproduced in the catalogs of her collection. Within a year, she was engaged to an American writer named Lawrence Vail, whom the Parisian expatriates called the King of Bohemia, a title he had earned, by that point, mostly by getting arrested. They married in March of 1922. Their son, Sinbad, was born in 1923 in New York. Their daughter, Pegeen, was born in August of 1925 in Auchy, in Switzerland. The marriage was, by every surviving account, unhappy. Vail drank. He struck her. Peggy, whose personality had been formed by the emotional withdrawal of her mother after Benjamin's death, wept and did not fight back. She would later write of that marriage that the fights went on for hours, sometimes days, sometimes for 2 weeks at a time, and that she should have fought back, and that all she did was weep. It was a description that could have applied without much editing to the marriage of her mother. They divorced in 1930. Peggy took custody of Pegeen. She kept Sinbad through the summers. Through the 1930s, Peggy lived a life that had, in it, both extraordinary generosity and considerable private pain. She fell in love with a writer named John Holmes, whom she considered the great love of her life, and who died in 1934 during a minor operation that had gone unexpectedly wrong. She lived for several years with a British Marxist named Douglas Garman, and then with a French writer named Yves Tanguy, and then briefly with the Irish writer Samuel Beckett, who introduced her to the modern painting she had until then paid only intermittent attention to. In 1938, on Beckett's advice and with Duchamp's practical help, she opened a small gallery in London at 30 Cork Street in Mayfair. She called it Guggenheim Jeune, a pun on the family's uncle in New York, the Solomon whose own museum then had not yet been named. Her first exhibition in the winter of 1938 was a solo show of Wassily Kandinsky. Her uncle Solomon in New York was purchasing Kandinsky at the same moment through Hilaribe. The two Guggenheims did not speak. Guggenheim Jeune ran for 18 months. It lost money. In the summer of 1939, Peggy resolved to close the gallery and instead to begin building a permanent collection. She drew up a list of the modern painters whose work she believed a serious museum should own. Then, in the autumn of 1939, the war began. Peggy, undeterred, spent the first year and a half of the war traveling through occupied and unoccupied France, buying paintings from artists who were desperate to sell them because they had been declared degenerate by the German occupation and were being hunted. Her rule in that period became a phrase that later biographers repeated in mild disbelief. My motto was, buy a picture a day. She bought Kandinsky and Klee. She bought Leger and Mondrian. She bought Brancusi. She bought Max Ernst, whom she also, in 1941, married, having arranged his escape from Marseille with an entry visa she paid for personally. They divorced in 1946. The collection she assembled in those years and expanded through the 1940s in New York is now the collection of the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. She opened at first a gallery in New York in October of 1942 at 30 West 57th Street, called Art of This Century, designed by the Austrian architect Friedrich Kiesler, and hung in a way no gallery had ever been hung before. She showed in the first years of its existence the first solo exhibitions of Jackson Pollock, of Robert Motherwell, of Mark Rothko, of William Baziotes. She gave Pollock a monthly stipend so that he could paint without teaching. When Art of This Century closed in 1947, she took her collection and herself to Venice. She bought on the Grand Canal an unfinished 18th century palazzo, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, which had never been raised beyond a single story, and which she filled with her paintings and with the brains she preferred to human company. She opened the palazzo to the public in 1950. She lived there more or less continuously for the remaining 29 years of her life. The private cost of her life was by then considerable. Her sister Benita had died in childbirth in New York in 1927. Her sister Barbara Hazel, the youngest of the three Guggenheim daughters born to Benjamin and Florette, had, in the middle of the same decade, endured a private catastrophe that the family had, in the manner of its class, kept out of the newspapers as far as it could be kept out. In October of 1928 in New York, Hazel's two very young sons died in a fall. The police, after 2 investigations, ruled the fall accidental. The private circle around the family, some of it, whispered otherwise. What had happened on that afternoon and the manner in which it had happened was never conclusively established. Hazel, who was 25, was taken in by her mother and, for the rest of her long life, painted and married a series of husbands and lived at the edge of the family, largely forgotten by it. She died in New Orleans in 1995 at the age of 92. Peggy's own children, Sinbad and Pegeen, grew up in the transatlantic drift of their mother's life. Sinbad settled in France, worked in publishing, and lived a quiet life. He died of cancer in 1986. Pegeen, the daughter Peggy had raised herself, became a painter. She married the French abstract artist Jean Hélion in 1946 and had 3 sons with him. Later, she divorced Hélion and married the English writer Ralph Rumney, with whom she had a 4th son. In March of 1967, Pegeen died in Paris. She was 41. The circumstances of her death are recorded in the biographies of her mother as a suicide. Peggy, who had been in Venice, was devastated. She wrote in a letter that she had lost the person she had loved most in the world. She wore black for the remainder of her life. Peggy Guggenheim died at a hospital at Campo San Piero, near Padua, in December of 1979. She was 81. Her ashes are buried in the garden of the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, alongside the graves of her dogs. The palazzo is administered today by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, the New York Foundation, whose director had been Peggy's chief adversary for a quarter of a century, and which in the end absorbed her collection into the larger institutional shell of the family's museum. The Venetian Palace and the Fifth Avenue Spiral are now, formally, two limbs of the same body. This is the accommodation the Guggenheim family came to over 3 generations, between the metal and the art, and between the brothers who had made the money and the daughter of the brother who had died. At the height of the 21st century, the Guggenheim family is no longer, in the older sense, a dynasty. The 7 brothers of the second generation had, between them, 16 surviving children. Those children had children. Those grandchildren had children. The mining fortune, divided and divided again, has been converted, for most of the descendants, into ordinary upper-middle-class comfort. A financial house called Guggenheim Partners, founded in the late 1990s by a British Guggenheim descendant named Peter Lawson Johnston, now manages more than $300 billion in assets, the largest single vehicle in the family's contemporary financial life, and a sign that the name, in the way names of this kind persist, has kept some part of its old commercial gravity. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, based in the White Spiral, now administers museums in New York, in Venice, and since 1997, in Bilbao, in the Basque Country of Spain. The Peggy Guggenheim collection remains, by the count of the Venetian Tourism Authority, one of the most visited cultural sites in the city. Asarco, the smelting trust the 7 brothers had cornered in April of 1901, went bankrupt in 1999, was reorganized, and was, in the end, acquired by a Mexican mining company called Grupo Mexico. The Guggenheim name is no longer attached to it in any commercial sense. The mines of Bingham Canyon and Chuquicamata are still worked by companies whose names would have been unfamiliar to Daniel Guggenheim. The Kennecott operations in Alaska were shuttered decades ago. The town of Kennecott is now a National Historic Landmark, a ghost town of red-painted wooden buildings as preserved by the National Park Service. The building on Fifth Avenue is now 67 years old. The concrete has weathered. The interior lighting has been renewed several times. The paintings are the paintings Rebay chose, and Peggy chose, and the curators who came after them chose. The ramp on any afternoon is full of visitors moving slowly upward, past the Kandinskys, past the Klees, past the corner where a single small bower hangs in acknowledgement of a working relationship that broke, in the end, in ways nobody who set out on it would have wished. If one walks the ramp today, from the ground floor to the top, and lets one's hand rest for a moment against the white curved wall, one is touching a surface that Frank Lloyd Wright designed at the request of a baronin, who died believing she had been erased from her own museum, paid for by a rich widower who had never in his life imagined that a peddler's grandson would build such a thing, from a fortune that a village boy from Lengnau had begun to accumulate 115 years earlier by selling stove polish door to door. All of that is folded into the wall. None of it is visible on the wall. That is the peculiar quality of large old fortunes converted into public architecture. The ledgers become concrete, and the concrete does not remember the ledgers. Everything travels. The metal traveled, from the mountains of Colorado to the smelters of Mexico to the ports of Chile to the vaults of Wall Street. The name traveled from Argao to Philadelphia to New York to Venice to Bilbao. The family traveled from the wooden houses of Roxborough to the marble entrances of Fifth Avenue, from the deck of the Titanic to the launch pads of White Sands, from the salons of Paris to a garden in Venice, where the graves of dogs are laid beside the ashes of a woman who had inherited less than any of her cousins. The peddler who began it never saw any of it. The mother who had taught her sons that a library mattered as much as a ledger did not live to see her granddaughter open a gallery in London. The brother in evening wear did not live to see the museum in Venice that would carry his daughter's name. The Baroness who wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright did not live to see the spiral open. Peggy, at the end of her life, in Venice, was heard to say that she had wanted, above all things, to be a good custodian of what she had gathered. It was, one of her biographers wrote, the most modest description any Guggenheim had ever offered of anything they had done. Some names in the end are worth more for the questions they turn into buildings than for the fortunes they turned into ledgers.